Okay, okay. So if any of you are actually listening to this, I am serious. I did actually. Or I not I did. I'm probably going to read through some fairy tales. Um, this is definitely gonna be staying as unlisted. I have to say, if yeah, this is not gonna be a public video on the channel. Needless to say, because it's going to be completely unedited. It's going to be on the fly. We just kind of go through. We're going to mess some stuff up, and it's going to sound horrible. The audio quality is going to be questionable at best, and I don't know how long it's going to take me to read through the books. I'm not sure if we're going to do any voices. We'll see what happens. Okay. So the stories we have to go through are Cinderella, Puss in Boots, Hansel and Gretel, Sleeping Beauty, Snow White and the Seven Dwarves, and Rumpelstiltskin. Okay, so we're gonna make our way through all of those, probably. I think. All right, we'll see. We'll see what happens. Okay, so we're gonna start with Cinderella. All right. Okay. So this is a Cinderella from the First Fairy Tales collection. Alright, let's get started. Once upon a time, there was a beautiful girl called Cinderella. She had two ugly stepsisters who made her do all the work. She had to sweep the floors, cook the food, and wash the dishes while they dressed up and went to parties. One day, a royal invitation arrived at Cinderella's house. The king's only son was going to have a grand ball, and all three girls were invited. Cinderella knew she wouldn't be allowed to go to the ball, but the ugly sisters were excited. They couldn't talk about anything else. When the day of the ball came, Cinderella had to rush about. She fixed their hair, helped them put on their new dresses, and arranged their jewels, just so. As soon as they had gone, Cinderella sat down by the fire and said, "I wish I could go to the ball." Then, whoosh! Okay, beside her stood a lady holding a silver wand. "Cinderella," she said, "I am your fairy godmother, and you shall go to the ball. But first, bring me a pumpkin from the garden, 6 mice from the mice trap, a whiskey rat, and 6 lizards." So, Cinderella fetched a pumpkin, 6 mice, a whiskey rat, and 6 lizards. The fairy godmother touched them with her wand, and the pumpkin became a golden coach. The mice became 6 grey horses, the rat became a coachman with an enormous moustache, and the lizards became 6 footmen dressed in green and yellow. Then the fairy godmother touched Cinderella with the wand, and her old dress became a golden dress sparkling with jewels, while on her feet were the prettiest pair of glass slippers ever seen. "Remember," said the fairy godmother, "you must leave before the clock strikes 12, because at midnight the magic ends." Thank you, fairy godmother," said Cinderella, and she climbed into the coach. When Cinderella arrived at the ball, she looked so beautiful that everyone wondered who she was, even the ugly sisters. The prince asked her to dance with him, and they danced all evening. He would not dance with anyone else. Now, Cinderella was enjoying the ball so much that she forgot her fairy godmother's warning until it was almost midnight and the clock began to strike. 1, 2, 3. She ran out of the ballroom. 4, 5, 6. As she ran down the palace steps, one of her glass slippers fell off. 7, 8, 9. She ran towards the golden coach. 10, 11, 12. Then Cinderella was in her old dress. A pumpkin lay at her feet, and scampering down the road were 6 mice, a whiskey rat, and 6 lizards. So Cinderella had to walk home, and by the time the ugly sisters returned, she was sweeping the floor. Now, when Cinderella ran from the palace, the prince followed her, and he found the glass slipper. He said, "I shall marry this beautiful girl whose foot first sits this slipper." In the morning, The prince went from house to house with the glass slipper, and every young lady tried to squeeze her foot into it, but it didn't fit any of them. At last the prince came to Cinderella's house. First, one ugly sister tried to squash her foot into the slipper, but her foot was too big and fat. Then the other ugly sister tried, but her foot was too long and thin. "Please," said Cinderella, "let me try." "The slipper won't fit you," said the ugly sisters. "You didn't go to the ball." But Cinderella slipped her foot into the glass slipper, and it fitted perfectly. Then whoosh! Beside her stood the fairy godmother. She touched Cinderella with her wand, and there she was, in a golden dress sparkling with jewels, and on her feet was the prettiest pair of glass slippers ever seen. The ugly sisters were so surprised they couldn't think of anything to say. But the prince knew what to say. He asked Cinderella to marry him. And there was a happy wedding. Everyone who had gone to the ball was invited, even the ugly sisters. There was wonderful food and lots of music and dancing. And the prince, of course, danced every dance with Cinderella. Okay, alright, one down. One down. Next one, Chief. Okay, so we've done Cinderella. The next book is Rumpelstiltskin. Okay, the picture of this is some older man dancing in front of some hay bales. I'm not sure what this is about, to be honest, but I guess we're gonna find out. All right. All right, Rumpelstiltskin. Once upon a time, there was a foolish farmer who had a beautiful, clever daughter. One day, the farmer went off to the palace and started to show off. He said to the king, "I have a beautiful daughter." But the king took no notice, and the father said, "And she's clever, and she can spin straw into gold." Now, the king loved gold. "Oh ho," he said, "I'd like to see your daughter." So, the farmer hurried home and told his daughter that the king wanted to see her. But when the girl got to the palace, the king took her to a room where there was a pile of straw and a spinning wheel. "Spin this straw into gold," he said, and off he went. The girl didn't know what to do, and she began to cry. But then, a strange little man jumped in through the window. "Beautiful girl," he said, "why are you crying?" "I must spin this straw into gold," she answered, "and I don't know how to do it." "What will you give me," said the little man, "if I do it for you?" "My necklace," she said, and she gave it to him. The little man sat down, the spinning wheel whirled round and round, and the straw was spun into gold. Then, with a skip and a jump, he was gone. But when the king saw the gold, he was pleased, but he wanted more. So he took the girl into a room where there was a bigger pile of straw. "Spin this straw into gold," he said, and off he went. Again, the girl began to cry, and then the strange little man jumped in through the window. "More straw," he said. "What will you give me if I spin it for you?" "My ring," she said, and she gave it to him. Again, the spinning wheel whirled round and round, and the straw was spun into gold. Then, with a skip and a jump, he was gone. When the king saw the gold, he was very pleased, but he wanted even more, so he took the gold to a room where there was an even bigger pile of straw. It reached right to the ceiling. "Spin this straw into gold," he said, and off he went. Again, the girl began to cry, and then the strange little man jumped in through the window. "Even more straw," he said. "What will you give me if I spin it for you?" "I have nothing left," said the girl sadly. "Then promise," he said, "that when you are clean, you will give me your first little baby." "Oh," she said, "all right, I promise." Once again the spinning wheel whirled round and round, and the straw was spun into gold. Then, with a skip and a jump, the little man was gone. When the king saw the gold, he was very, very pleased. He thought, "This girl is clever and beautiful." So he asked her to marry him, and the farmer's daughter became the queen. A year passed by, and the queen had a baby. She had forgotten her promise to the little man. But the little man had not forgotten. One day he jumped in through the window. "Now you must give me our baby," he said. "Oh no," she said. "I'll give you jewels, a castle, anything, but not my baby." "The baby is what I want," he said. The queen began to cry, and the little man was sorry for her. He said, "If you can guess my name, you can keep your baby. I will give you 3 days and 3 guesses each day." As soon as the little man had gone, the queen sent servants all over the land to collect lots of different names. When the little man came back the next day, she said, "Is your name Casper? Is it Jehoshaphat? Is it Balthazar?" But to each one he said, "No, that's not my name." On the second day, the queen said, "Is your name Skinny Legs? Is it Rummy Tummy? Is it Beaky Nose?" But to each one the little man said, "No, that's not my name." On the morning of the third day, the queen was worried. She had only 3 guesses left. Then one of the servants told her that he had seen a strange little man skipping round a fire in the forest. He was singing this song. "Around and around I dance and I sing, but nobody knows I'm Rumpelstiltskin." The queen clapped her hands. "That's his name," she said, "Rumpelstiltskin." When the little man came for the last time, the queen said, "I wonder, is your name John?" "No," he laughed, "that's not my name." "I wonder," she said, "could it be Tom?" "No, no," he laughed, "that's not my name." "Well," said the queen, "is it Rumpelstiltskin?" "Who told you?" he shouted. "Who? Who?" He was so angry, he stamped a hole in the floor and whooshed through it. He was never seen again. Then the queen picked up her baby, and she gave her lovely baby a great big happy hug. Alright. Two down. Oh, why am I doing this? I don't know. Okay, next one. Snow White and the 7 Dwarves. Alright. So this... I'm not going to do a different voice for each of the dwarves. I can't even do a voice for like 2 different characters. Okay. Once upon a time, there was a princess. Her name was Snow White, and she was very pretty. She had shiny black hair, lips as red as cherries, and skin as white as snow. When Snow White was small, her mother died, and her father, the king, married again. Snow White's stepmother, the queen, was very beautiful, but she was powerful and vain. She had a powerful magic mirror. Well, I just said powerful twice when it's not written in either of those sentences. Let's just go back. Okay, Snow White's stepmother, the queen, was very beautiful, but she was proud and vain. She had a magic mirror, and when she looked into it, she said, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the loveliest one of all?" And the mirror always answered, "You are the loveliest, O Queen." But Snow White was growing prettier and prettier. One day, when the Queen looked into the mirror, it said, "O Queen, you are lovely, it is true, but Snow White is far lovelier than you." "Then she must die," said the Queen. She ordered a huntsman to take Snow White into the forest and kill her. But the huntsman did not want to hurt Snow White, so he took her into the forest and left her there. Poor Snow White walked on until she came to a cottage. She knocked at the door. When no one answered, she turned the handle and walked in. Inside, a table was laid with 7 little knives and forks, 7 little loaves on 7 little plates, and 7 little glasses of wine. Around the table were 7 little chairs, and along one wall were 7 little beds. Snow White was tired and hungry, So she ate some bread and drank some wine. Then she lay down on a bed and fell asleep. When it was almost dark, the doors opened and in came 7 dwarves. They saw Snow White and said, "Oh, what a lovely girl!" When Snow White saw the 7 dwarves, she was surprised, but they were all so friendly that she told them all about herself. "Stay with us," they said, "but when we go to work, keep the door locked and don't buy anything from anybody." Every day, Snow White cleaned the cottage and cooked, while the 7 dwarves went to dig for gold in the hills. But one day, back at the palace, the queen looked in the mirror and it said, "O Queen, you are lovely, it is true, but Snow White is far lovelier than you, and in the hills in the forest shade with 7 dwarves as a home she is made." "She must die," said the wicked queen. She filled a basket with ripe apples and put some poison on the rosy red half of the biggest apple. She didn't touch the green half. Then she disguised herself as an old woman and she went to the forest. When she came to the 7 dwarfs' cottage, she knocked and called, "Ripe apples for sale." Snow White opened the window. "I'm sorry," she said, "but I mustn't buy anything from anybody." The old woman picked up the biggest apple. She cut it in half and ate the green half. Then she held out the poisoned rosy red half and said, "Have a piece of my sweet juicy apple." She seemed kind, and the apple looked delicious, so Snow White reached out and took it. But when she bit into the apple, she fell down as if she were dead. The wicked queen hurried back to the palace. This time the mirror said, "You are the loveliest, O Queen." The 7 dwarves came home and found Snow White lying on the floor. They tried to wake her, but they could not. So they made a glass coffin for her and placed it high on a hill. They took turns to guard it, and for a long time Snow White lay there, still as lovely as ever. Then one day a prince came riding by. When he saw Snow White, he fell in love with her and asked the dwarves if he could take the glass coffin back to his father's palace. The dwarves did not want to lose Snow White, but they could see the prince loved her, so they agreed. Then, as they lifted the coffin, one of the dwarves stumbled and jolted it, and the piece of poisoned apple fell out of Snow White's mouth. She opened her eyes and said, "Where am I?" How happy they all were! The prince asked Snow White to marry him, and she said yes. Then she said goodbye to the 7 dwarves and rode off with the prince. When they reached his father's palace, everyone began to get ready for the wedding. Now the wicked queen was invited to the wedding, but before she left, she looked in the mirror and asked her usual question. The mirror said, "O Queen, you are lovely, it is true, but the new bride is far lovelier than you." "I must see this new bride," said the queen, and she hurried off to the wedding. But when she saw that the lovely bride was Snow White, she was so full of rage that she fell down and died. But Snow White and the prince and the 7 dwarves all lived happily ever after. You read back through some of these stories now, and you just question some of the things that are in there. like hold on, is that okay? Is that all good? Yeah, it's quite something when you actually think about what it's saying. But anyway, that's 3 down, 3 to go. All right, next one. Sleeping Beauty is the next one on the in the collection, so to speak. Let's get started. All right. So, Sleeping Beauty. Well, once upon a time, there was a king and a queen. When their baby daughter was born, they were so happy they decided to have a party. They invited all their family and their friends and all the fairies in the land. Now, there were 13 fairies altogether, but the king and queen only invited 12. They completely forgot about the 13th. It was a splendid party, There were gold dishes piled high with delicious food for everyone. When everyone had finished, the fairies gathered round the baby's cradle, and they each made a magic wish. "The princess shall be beautiful," said the first. "And happy," said the second. "And kind," said the third. And so they went on. The princesses were so brave and clever. She was to have a sweet singing voice and light dancing feet. But then, just as the 12th fairy was about to make her wish, in came the 13th. She was furious. She had not been invited to the party. "Here is my wish," she said. "When the princess is 16, she will prick her finger on a spindle and die." And with that, the 13th fairy vanished. The 12th fairy said, "I cannot change the wicked fairy's powerful magic, so the princess will prick her finger. But she will not die. She will fall asleep for 100 years. The king and queen thanked the 12th fairy for her wish, but they were sad. They did not want their daughter to sleep for 100 years. The king and queen ordered that every spindle and spinning wheel in the land must be chopped up and burnt. Then they thought their daughter would be safe. The years passed, and the princess grew up. She was very beautiful and clever. She was everything the fairies had wished her to be. Then, on her 16th birthday, the princess was exploring the castle, and she found a little room at the top of a tall tower. In the room was an old woman by a spinning wheel. "What are you doing?" asked the princess. "I'm spinning," said the old woman, who was really the wicked 13th fairy. "Would you like to try?" "Oh, yes," said the princess, and she sat down by the spinning wheel. But as soon as she touched the spindle, the sharp point pricked her finger, and she fell asleep. Then the old woman vanished. At the same moment, the king and queen, the servants, and the cats and dogs all fell asleep. Even the fire stopped burning, and the roasting meat stopped sizzling. Everything slept. A hedge of wild roses grew up around the castle. It grew and grew until the castle was almost hidden. 100 years passed, and then a prince came riding by and saw the top of a tower behind the hedge of roses. "How strange," he said. "I never knew there was a castle here." He jumped off his horse and lifted his sword to cut a way through the hedge, but as soon as the sword touched a bramble, a path opened up. The prince entered the castle and walked from room to room. Imagine his surprise, finding everyone and everything fast asleep. At last, he entered a little room at the top of a tall tower, and he saw the sleeping princess. She looked so beautiful that he bent down and kissed her. The spell was broken. The princess opened her eyes, and everybody and everything in the castle awoke. The king yawned, the queen blinked, the cats had a good stretch, and the dogs wagged their tails. The servants began to work, the fire began to flame, and the roasting meat began to sizzle. 100 years had not changed anyone or anything. And then the beautiful princess married the prince who had woken her from such a long, deep sleep. Alright, that's it apparently. I swear, right? Like, these stories don't make any sense. I don't know. Okay, next. Well, we go next. Like, I swear, half of these books or fairy tales are basically like teenage girl Instagram simulator, right? Someone forgets to invite some like girl to the Instagram group or like the Snapchat friend circle or whatever, and like it all kicks off, you know. People are dying, you know, getting married, all that fun stuff. But yeah, okay. All right, next one. Hanzel and Gretel. Alright. So, alright, Hanzel and Gretel. Where is the first page? Okay. Once upon a time, a boy and a girl called Hanzel and Gretel lived with their father and stepmother in a little house beside a big forest. The family was poor and never had enough to eat. One night, When the children were in bed, the stepmother said, "Let's take Hansel and Gretel in the forest and leave them there." "Oh no, I won't do that," said the father. "I love my children." "We must," she said. "We haven't enough food for all of us." Now, Hansel and Gretel were so hungry they couldn't sleep, and they heard everything. So I just want to interject for a moment to point out that the picture here is of the two of them in the same bed. Alabama. Any Alabamas in the chat? Okay, anyway. Gretel began to cry, but Hansel whispered, "Don't cry, little sister. I'll look after you." Then he crept outside and filled his pocket with white pebbles. In the morning, the children's stepmother told them that the whole family was going into the forest to collect firewood. Off they went, but Hansel walked behind and dropped white pebbles on the path. When they came to a clearing, the stepmother said, "Wait here while we chop down some trees." Now Hansel and Gretel were tired and soon fell asleep. When they woke, it was night. But Hansel saw his white pebbles shining in the moonlight. So he held Gretel's hand, and they followed the pebbles back to their own little house. Their father was very happy when he saw them, but their stepmother was not. The next night she said to him, "We must take Hansel and Gretel into the forest again, and this time they must not come back." Once again the children heard everything, and Hansel crept off to find pebbles. But the door was locked and he could not get out. For breakfast, their stepmother gave them a piece of dry bread. Hansel put it in his pocket. Then the family went off to collect firewood, but Hansel walked behind and dropped white breadcrumbs on the path. When they were deep in the forest, the stepmother said, "Wait here while we chop down some trees." Once again, Hansel and Gretel fell asleep, and when they woke, it was night. But Hansel could not see his breadcrumbs. Birds had eaten them. Hansel did not know which way to go, but he held Gretel's hand, and they walked and walked. The next day, they came to a clearing, and there was a house. The next day, they came to a clearing, and there was a house. A strange and wonderful house. It had gingerbread walls, barley sugar windows, and a roof made of cakes and cookies. Hansel snapped off some of the icing and bit into it. Gretel broke off some gingerbread and popped it in her mouth. The door opened, and an old woman with ruby red eyes came out. She said, "Who's nibbling at my house?" "I'm sorry," said Hansel, "but I'm very hungry." "Then come in," said the old woman. So Hansel and Gretel went in, and she gave them sugary pancakes, milk and apples. When they had eaten, she took them into a room with 2 little beds, and soon Hansel and Gretel were fast asleep. They did not know that the old woman was a witch who caught children and ate them. In the morning, the witch crept in, bent down and looked at the children very closely, because she could not see clearly. "Too thin to eat," she said. She took Hansel and woke him, and she put him in a cage. She shook Gretel and shouted, "Get up, lazy bones, light the fire, wash the dishes, and be quick about it." From that time on, Gretel had to work hard, but Hansel was kept in the cage. The witch gave him lots of food to make him fat, and every day she said, "Show me your fingers so I can feel how fat you are." Now, Hansel had found a small chicken bone in the cage, and guess what he did? He pushed out the bone instead of his finger. When the witch felt the bone, she always said, "Still too thin." But one day, the witch said to Gretel, "Light the fire and heat the oven. Today I'm going to roast your brother and eat him." When the oven was very hot, the witch said, "Climb inside and see if it is hot enough." Gretel said, "How can I get in?" "Put your head in like this," said the witch, leaning forward. Then Gretel gave her a hard push, and the witch went head over heels into the oven. Gretel slammed the door shut, and that was the end of the wicked witch. Gretel ran to the cage. She unlocked it and Hanzel was free. Then they opened the witch's treasure chest and filled their pockets with silver, gold, and jewels. "Let's go home," said Hanzel. They walked and walked until at last they came to a path they knew. They saw their own little house and they ran. Their father was very happy to see them. He had looked for them in the forest every day. This had made their stepmother angry, and one day she had packed her clothes and left. From that time on, Hansel, Gretel and their father lived happily in the little house beside the big forest. Because of the witch's treasure, they had plenty of money and could buy lots of food. So, Hansel and Gretel never went to bed hungry again. Okay, I have to point out a few things in this book that I just can't look back. No. Like Hansel, Gretel, come on, please, right? They take you to a clearing, you know they're gonna leave you there. Why do you fall asleep, dude? Come on. The least you can do is stay awake so you can find your way back in the daytime. Come on. You don't just be like, oh, my parents are taking me to this clearing to leave me here so that they can get enough food to eat. Let's just fall asleep. Like, I don't know, okay. We have one more, and then we're all donezo. Puss in Boots is our final story of the day. Final story. This is the last fairy tale I have, I think. Okay, of this collection at least. Right, let's just get started. Okay, Puss in Boots. In an old windmill on top of a hill, there once lived a poor man and his 3 sons. When the poor man died, he left the windmill to the eldest son, the donkey to the second, and the third got Puss, the family cat. The youngest son was disappointed. "I'm very fond of you, Puss, but you're not very useful except for catching mice." Puss looked up and he said, "Get me a bag and a pair of boots and I'll show you what I can do." So the lad quickly found a bag and his own best soft leather boots. Puss pulled on the boots and they shrank until they fitted perfectly. Then he rose up on his hind legs, slung the bag over his shoulder and marched off. When he came to a field where there were rabbit holes, he picked dandelion leaves, stuffed them in the bag and made a rabbit trap. Before long, a plump rabbit hopped into the bag and began to eat the leaves. Clever Puss quickly closed the bag and slung it over his shoulder. Then off he marched to the royal palace and gave the rabbit to the king. "Your Majesty," said Puss, bowing low, "here is a present from my master, the Duke of Carabas." And the king said, "I thank your master, the Duke of Carabas." Then off went Puss with the empty bag. Next morning, Puss marched off again. When he came to a cornfield, he picked corn, dropped it in the bag and made a partridge trap. And Clever Puss caught 2 plump partridges and took them to the king. The next morning, Puss said to the youngest son, "Come with me, do exactly what I tell you and I'll make you fortune." So they marched off until they came to a river that flowed past the royal palace. "This afternoon," said Puss, "the king is going to drive with his beautiful daughter. You shall meet her, then marry her. Now, take off these old clothes and go for a swim." "All right, Puss," said the lad, and he took off his clothes and jumped into the river. Then Puss stuffed everything into his bag and hid it under a large stone. As soon as the royal carriage appeared, Puss waved and shouted, "Help! Help!" When the king saw the strange cat who had brought him presents, he stopped the carriage. "Your Majesty," said Puss, "while my master, the Duke of Carabas, was swimming, thieves stole all his clothes." "He has no clothes?" exclaimed the king. "That won't do." And he ordered a servant to fetch some new clothes from the palace. When the servant returned with the clothes, the lad climbed out of the river and put them on. Then he looked so handsome and grand, just like a real duke. He bowed to the king and the beautiful princess and said, "Your Majesty, thank for your kindness." "And I thank you, Duke of Carabas, for your presents," said the king. "Now, will you join us for a ride in the country?" So the lad climbed into the carriage and they were off. And Puss, what about him? He ran ahead until he came to a huge cornfield where men were busy cutting the corn. Puss knew that the field belonged to a fierce ogre, but he shouted, "Listen! When the king comes by, tell him that the field and land round about belong to the Duke of Carabas. If you don't, I shall chop you into mincemeat." When the royal carriage came bowling along and the king saw the huge cornfield, he called out, "Who owns this field?" And the men sang out, "The field and land round about belong to the Duke of Carabas." The king thought, "This duke must be rich." And Puss, what about him? He ran ahead until he came to the ogre's castle, but he knocked at the door. Bam! 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 The door swung open, and there stood the ogre. He was enormous. "Mighty ogre," said Puss, "I might have heard that you are a great magician and you can change into an elephant, a lion, anything." "True," said the ogre, "and Vloom is a lion." Puss was so scared that he raced inside and jumped onto a table. Then, vroom, the lion was an ogre again. "Amazing," said Puss, "but can you change into any tiny animal, like a mouse? That must be impossible for an enormous ogre." "Impossible?" bellowed the ogre. He was angry, and vroom, a mouse was running across the floor. Puss was quick, one big leap, and he caught the mouse and gobbled him up. A few moments later, Puss heard the sound of the carriage wheels, so he hurried outside. He bowed and said, "Welcome to the castle of my master, the Duke of Carabas." The king looked up at the huge castle and he thought, "This duke must be very rich." Then Puss led everyone into the castle. It was full of treasure, and the king thought, "This duke must be very, very rich." He said, "Duke of Carabas, would you like to marry my daughter?" The lad looked at the beautiful princess, and she smiled. So he asked her to marry him, and after that there was a wedding. And clever Puss in Boots, what about him? He lived for many happy years in the ogre's castle with his master and the beautiful princess. He had his own velvet cushion by the fire, plenty of saucers full of cream, and lots of other tasty treats. Okay, no, we're done now. Like, that was six fairy tales, 38 minutes. Oh, I didn't know why I decided to do this. Okay, if you actually listen to even one of those stories all the way through, I'll be amazed. If you listen to the whole 14 minutes, what are you doing with your life? Okay, goodbye.